Hey, and welcome to Things Worth Learning. I'm your host, Matt Stauffer, and this is a show where a curious computer programmer that's me interviews fascinating people about their passions. My guest today is Evan You, the creator of the JavaScript frameworks Vue.js and Vite. Evan, would you mind telling the audience a little bit about yourself, whether it's your personal or your professional life?
Hi, my name is Evan You, and I'm a full-time independent open source developer. I currently live in Singapore. I have 2 kids, and I work for myself, so really enjoying this lifestyle right now.
I love that. And that's, we'll get there a little bit more, but I do want to say, let's say that somebody who's listening, because this is not an entirely technical audience, has never heard of open source before. What does it mean to be an open source developer versus to work at, a closed source or a company or whatever else? What's the difference between, and we'll talk about this more later, but the basic difference, how you describe it to people.
Sure. Interestingly, so I'm a programmer, right? I write software. The difference from commercial software is that I don't sell the things I write. All the code that I write is open and free. Anyone can access it. Anyone can use it. There's no barrier at all. So it's all completely free. So, but somehow I managed to find ways to make a living out of it.
Yep. Which we'll talk about more in a second, that's for sure. But I just want to make sure. So when he says full stack, we're saying a whole bunch of different types of technologies, all being written by Evan and a group of other people, all being given away for free. And we'll talk about that in a bit. But before we go there, can you tell me, do you have any sort of life mantra or phrase or idea that you'd like to live your life by?
Well, I guess I don't have a specific motto or mantra, but I just want to live by doing things that I really enjoy doing. So that's the basic rule that I've been following. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes the simple one's the best one. And it's weird that can be countercultural. That what you just said is not common. So, good on it. I love it.
Oh.
So that kind of the primary topic of this thing is to give you the chance to talk about one particular topic. So could you introduce for us today, what are we actually going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so I want to talk about this sort of, I guess it's more like a combination of 2 things. One is working on open source and somehow make a living out of it. And 2 is just in general being self-employed and being able to work from anywhere and have a, I guess, not being physically tied to a specific location or an employer or anything.
Yeah. Well, and there's a ton of fun stuff we can talk about there, but let's start we started with what is open source. So now let's start with the obvious first question, which is, if you're giving it all away, how are you actually getting paid? So can we just start there? What does that actually look like for you?
Sure. So there are, in the beginning, right, when I created the projects that I work on, I never thought about making money out of them. These projects started as side projects when I was still working full time. But over time, it got so popular, right? When you have, I guess, in the age of with the internet, when you have something that attracts an audience, literally anything that attracts an audience, you can turn it into an asset that generates income. So that's the rule of thumb, right? If you think about these TikTok influencers, right?
Yeah.
How they make money is they convert all these audience, all this traffic into some sort of money. So the same with open source. There are different ways of making money out of open source. There are people starting companies. There are successful companies built on top of open source. But the way they typically make money is they sell services on top of the free product that they provide. Right, so these enterprise, they use some free software, but then they realize, when there's a problem, we can't solve it ourselves, so they pay the people who created that software to provide service for them. But so I thought about that in the beginning, but quickly realized that's not the kind of thing I want to do, because providing service, selling service, is labor intensive, and you either need to spend time yourself doing that, or you need to then hire a lot of people and manage them to do that.
A whole team,
which is completely not what I want to do. I hate managing people. I don't want to be a boss. I don't want to run a company. So I want this sort of more passive sort of income something that I don't have to constantly be trading my time for. Right. So then I thought about sponsorships. Right. The proposition is pretty simple. I created a piece of useful software, and companies are building revenue generating products with it.
Yeah.
And if I don't have enough money to keep working on it, the project will be abandoned, and your product will suffer as a result. So if your company is using the software that I wrote to build commercial software, commercial products, then it makes sense for you to at least make sure it's sustainable, right? It's almost as if you are a bunch of companies are crowdsourcing money to fund one guy to keep maintaining a common piece of infrastructure shared by these companies.
That's
right?
good.
So this kind of model in theory works. And I think like this when you think about it, it totally makes sense, right? But it's a bit difficult in the open source world because the direct consumer of open source software, these developers, are usually not the people who can make the call in their companies, right? Yeah. They use your software because it's free, but when it comes to time to convince their boss to say, okay, we should sponsor this software, it's a different story, right? So that's the main bottleneck here, and in fact, to this day, this is still a really prominent problem in funding open source. Is because this disconnection between the direct consumer of the open source software compared to the people who can make the decision to say, okay, we'll actually sponsor this project. It's easier when you say, okay, like we need to actually pay for a service.
Right.
But it's much more difficult to go to your boss and say, okay, like we're using this piece of free software, but we should still give it money.
Yeah. It works fine. You don't have to pay money for it to work. And you should pay money anyway. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think the economical model like works in theory, but like in practice, there's a lot of friction in converting a user to someone who's willing to, a company that is willing to sponsor. Because from my experience, individual users usually they can't really. Like the conversion rate of open source software sponsoring user is extremely, extremely low. So Vue has probably over 1.7 million users worldwide, based on the stats that I collected a few months ago. But I have probably combined like 300 to 400 sponsors, paying sponsors.
That is a shockingly different number.
Yeah. So individuals, probably half of them, contribute very insignificant number of the total amount. Most of it comes from, the big chunk of it comes from businesses. Businesses who are willing to sponsor $500, $1,000, $2,000, or even more. Right. Yeah. These are the main players. However, because of this sort of different this connection that I talked about earlier. Typically, sponsors are smaller companies where the developer either is the boss themselves, or they have a really flat structure where the developer is able to convince the owner of the business to say, okay, this makes sense to sponsor it. Or the owner, the business owner themselves are technical enough to realize the value in it. Right. So this is a very this makes the conversion rate extremely low. But somehow, when you have enough traffic, it will still work. Yeah. So that's the case for Vue, because we have so many users. So even only a small number of these businesses realize, okay, like we want to actually do this, right? They create enough sponsorship income for me to keep working on Vue, right? So that's the main source of income. And outside of that, there's also some other form of income, like people selling themes. Okay. Kind of like WordPress has this ecosystem, people selling WordPress themes. Yeah. So front-end frameworks have an ecosystem of people selling like ready-made front-end kits or themes. It's almost like Tailwind selling, Tailwind UI.
Yeah.
It's along the same lines. So there are a lot of people doing this on top of front-end frameworks too. So we partner with them. Essentially, it's traffic because we can give them exposure by featuring their themes on our website, and then there's affiliation income.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And then we have education partners where video course producers, they make courses, teach people about Vue. We have great documentation, but a lot of people still prefer watching videos, right?
Yeah, definitely.
So it's similar to how Laravel partners with Laracast, and we have similar education providers who have subscription plans, and they also kick back a part of their revenue back to Vue in order to support us.
Right.
So this kind of partnerships is also really healthy because essentially when you have a large enough project, you create this sort of ecosystem where you start have people building their business on top of the software that you wrote, and because you doing better means they are doing better, so they're willing to also kick back a part of their earnings back to you in order to so it becomes a healthy circle. So that's pretty much the gist of it. So it's a combination of sponsorships, partnerships, affiliation, ads a little bit as well.
Yeah.
And as you can see, most of these are really passive form of income, right?
Yeah.
So it's not like I have to keep sourcing new projects, hit deadlines or anything.
Yeah.
I try to, when I think about how do I make money, I always think about what is the time cost of this? What is the, how passive it is? So I always try to prioritize income that is as passive as possible.
That makes sense. And especially because I assume that the majority of the money that's coming in is allowing you to do what you're doing. And so if you're consuming time that's being paid for to just try and get more money, well, now I have to make enough money that I can pay for my time making the money to other people, and it gets bigger and bigger, which is what you just said you didn't want to do. So
exactly, right? That's why sometimes when people ask, why don't you take some investment, start a company, right? I feel that distorts the incentive because I didn't create Vue to make money. I mean, in some way I am, because I still need to make a living.
Right.
But the priority is I want to make enough money so that I can keep doing what I want to do.
Yes.
Not that do what I would not want to do in order to make more money.
In order to make more money, exactly.
Yeah.
The goal is not the money. The goal is living the life you want to live, and the money allows you to do that. Right?
Exactly.
100%. Yeah. And that makes so much sense. And for those who haven't kind of been in this world before, a lot of people think, oh, I like doing this thing I'm doing, and this thing could be programming or whatever else. I'm going to start a business doing that thing. And the first advice I always give, which you clearly already know, is once you start a business doing it, you're not doing it anymore. You're now running a business, and you're doing taxes, and you're employing people, and you're managing, and you're hiring whatever. And so then it has to get big enough until one day, maybe eventually you can go back and do the thing that you were doing in the first place. Just do the thing. So I completely understand where you're coming from, and I love that idea. So you talked about a whole bunch of different ways where Vue in particular is able to pull in money, and there's other ways of doing it that you've chosen not to do. When we talk about this one where we've got sponsorships, one of the things I've been thinking about for a while is, what does it look like for me as a company owner to help encourage other company owners to understand this? And for example, I own a consultancy, so I can encourage other consultancies to give money, but I also realize that I can encourage my clients and say, hey, client, we just built this thing for you, and it's a lot cheaper for you to pay us to build it, because we didn't have to rebuild Vue from scratch. We didn't have to pay to rebuild Laravel from scratch when we built this thing. So you just paid us a third or a fifth or a tenth of what you would have paid because of this free thing. How can I do this? And so one of the things that's cool that I've been thinking about is that GitHub is trying to make it easy for programmers to understand, as a programmer, look at all my repos and figure out who's sponsoring. But now I'm realizing we really need to be able to make it so that a company can look at their one repo, right? And maybe this is a company who doesn't know, and say, whose work is this particular project relying on, and how can I therefore recognize that? And so you've got my brain spinning. I don't know if there's anything that sparks any conversation for you, but I just want you to know that I'm really fascinated thinking about this idea now. So, because I would love for any client that I ever have that I put on Vue to then go consider sponsoring you,
Yeah, it's I guess for your client to sponsor Vue, it's going to be a difficult sell, because for them there's just so many intermediates in there. And this sort of idea has been kicked around in open source developers for a while, because how can we, there are tools for you to programmatically like check in the project, like in your dependencies, like how much code belongs to which developer.
Yeah.
But then there's this problem of like how far you want to trickle it down. And like in the end, like say a company say, I want to like donate $1,000 for all the dependencies in my project. And maybe there will be 1,000 authors each getting $1. Like the logistic cost of this is extremely high. Like you need a very efficient infrastructure for this to actually work. And it needs to be at really high scale. Otherwise, like if you do like 1 off or 2 off, it's just like there's so much friction.
It's not even worth it. Yeah,
it's not feasible. Yeah. There are some platforms that are trying to do that. I mean, GitHub sponsors really already changed things a lot for a lot of people. I think the first step for GitHub sponsors is just kicking off this sort of developer to developer support system where like primarily right now it's developer to developers, but slowly businesses are getting a hand of it. They're realizing, okay, like we can use GitHub sponsors as a way to first support the open source projects that we use, and second, get exposure for the company themselves. Because you see, if you sponsor a lot of developers on GitHub, people display their sponsors are displayed in people's profiles.
Yeah.
So basically, your company's logo will pop up everywhere on GitHub when people
just
looking
by sponsoring
at other
people.
High-profile developers. They're like, oh, this company's sponsoring him. Oh, sponsoring him as well, sponsoring her as well. So
that's cool.
It's sort of a. I guess there are companies who are willing to try this kind of marketing strategy where like it's relatively low cost because you can literally get on there just sponsoring like $10 a month. It's still something. Right?
Yeah, you're still on there. Yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, right. And we're seeing other developers in the ecosystem. Like another example comes to mind is Anthony Fu. I don't know if you've come through his work, but Anthony has been extremely active in the Vue ecosystem and outside. He's created a lot of crazy projects. So he's running a very successful personal campaign. So it's a little bit different from Vue because I primarily run it under Vue and Vite. Basically, if you want to support Vue and Vite, you're also supporting me, right? So Anthony is more like, I am just creating a bunch of crazy stuff. You can sponsor me as a person. Okay. And then when I come up with a new crazy idea, you get early access to the code. Before it's like it's in private beta or something. So if you're a sponsor, you get to play with it early, and if you're not sponsoring, you have to maybe wait a couple months before it becomes open source.
And that leads me to a question I really wanted to ask you, and I'm sorry to interrupt, but like, do you get people expecting that because they're sponsoring you, they now get something they weren't otherwise? And how have you thought about, like, do I want to provide that, or do I want to say, no, you're already getting the work, you're just saying thank you for the work I already sent? Like, what's that kind of relationship like?
I try to make that extremely clear up front. So essentially, when you're sponsoring, there's no obligation for me to do anything special for you. If you want that becomes a service contract. It becomes I'm providing a service, but sponsorship is not a service. You're sponsoring for the work that I've already done, or I'm currently doing. Yeah.
And I've talked to a couple of people who are trying to set up their tiers, and each time, and for those who don't know, most of these sponsorship platforms, whether it's GitHub sponsors or Patreon or whatever else, allow you to sign up at like a $10 a month tier, a $50 a month tier, or whatever. And a lot of them have kind of like, they're so used to that from Kickstarter, they just assume each tier must have increasing benefits. It's like, or it could be just what you just described. You could just say, it's just thank you. And
I mean, there are still some tangible benefits. For example, you get your logo up on the website. Right. So the more you sponsor, the bigger your logo, the more prominent and bigger your logo will be. So the more likely people will notice you're sponsoring Vue. But that is the main thing. It's from a very return of investments perspective for the company. Supporting Vue is one aspect of it. A lot of companies do sponsor Vue just because of the exposure they want.
Interesting.
They want people to see their logo on the Vue website. They want people to click it and be curious, like, oh, what is this company doing? Or there's also something similar like Laravel does, like the partnership program, right? because sometimes there were people looking for agencies to provide service regarding a specific technology. They want someone trustworthy. So, what better than an agency that's being endorsed by the technology's creator itself, right? This kind of structure also is mutually beneficial because these agencies get leads. You get potentially generate more income, then you kick back part of it back to the project.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's really interesting hearing you talk about these mutually beneficial relationships between companies and Vue, because one of the ways of doing it is these consultancies that use Vue. But we've also talked a little bit about like the fact that there are companies whose actual content depends on Vue. So they're even more dependent. Like if you're making a Vue website that teaches all about Vue, you're more dependent on Vue than a consultancy or a startup that could theoretically, if Vue exploded, you could theoretically rip out all the Vue code and replace it with something else. That would be a bummer, but it's possible. But some of these other companies are literally, their existence is dependent entirely on it. And so I love kind of the point that you're making, that in some places there's a little bit of this reciprocity where they're saying, look, I understand that my entire thing is dependent on you. Of course, I'm going to kick a little back, but it's maybe a little bit harder to make that justification to a company that's like, oh, well, it's just part of my tech stack, right? Yeah. So that's all kind of part of the dance that you have to do. And then, like you were mentioning, you're mentioning the thing about dependencies. So for those who aren't familiar, open source tools almost always build on other open source tools, right? So like Vue is not all just Vue code. It also pulls in other dependencies. So even if someone were saying, my website is only my code and Vue and that's it, there would still be a whole bunch of other stuff that Vue is relying on. So that's kind of where some of the complexity comes from. Is that what you're talking about with like how far down in the dependency tree?
Yeah. So if you're only using Vue directly in the browser, Vue actually is dependency free. It's completely
Is it really?
Yeah.
That's incredible.
Yeah, but if you're, say, using some build tools like a tool chain, so the tool chain that we provide do pull in a lot of dependencies.
But that's cool. So Vue itself, just the code that's running, it's not pulling in LeftPad or any of those other JavaScript frameworks. It's all got its own custom stuff.
Yeah, because that's cool. Going to lead to a lot of bloat. So typically, framework authors are really particular about whether we pulling third-party dependencies. Usually, like even for the small utilities, we try to write our own to be as compact as efficient as possible.
So that's something that's really interesting because that's a JavaScript thing. And in PHP world, we're like, doesn't matter.
Yeah,
because it's living on the server, right? So we don't care about this thing. So that makes a ton of sense. And I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, the thing is, like in NPM, people constantly complain about how huge those dependencies are, right? Because when you think, okay, this runs on the server, you don't care about the size, and suddenly you have a dependency, you just install it, and you're pulling in like several megabytes on disk. But a lot of people don't realize in certain projects, like NPM also works for front end. So they install stuff from the front end, and suddenly you're pulling several megabytes of extra JavaScript in your browser.
Did not need to be there. Yep. 100%. And I think that's really helpful. Just a note to point out. You particularly have a reputation, and for those who don't know Evan, I just want to kind of hype him up a little. You have a reputation for looking at every tiny little detail and making it perform optimally and load. You know, like you and I actually just had a conversation on Twitter like a year ago where I gave a talk about how like this talk was sort of like, hey, I had this like load time issue with Vue, and I feel like 3 days later you're like, hey, here's a new version of Vue that doesn't have that problem. Here's why it was there in the first place. And I was just like blown away and I just saw you were just tweeting about it just a couple days ago. And I know that's not what we're talking about today on the podcast, but like the level of attention that you put in, you know what's going on at the browser level, you know what's going on in like the other frameworks that are going on, you know every single line of code, and you're like reworking these like really core ideas around, like, again, this is super nerdy for those of y'all who aren't nerd, but like the shadow DOM and all this kind of stuff. So it's just to note that like you are actively daily doing work that helps Vue continue to grow, that we would all be losing out if you weren't here doing. It's not like it's one of these things where it's like, oh, well, it's written, and now like basically this money is supporting you kind of like going swimming every day or whatever. You know what I mean? Like, there's work to be done continually in this world.
Yeah, there's always so much work. Actually, when you have a really popular open source project, just like I've pretty much given up cashing up on all the issues because just the sheer amount of issues coming in every day, just triaging them, just looking at them can take 1 or 2 hours every day. Other than just working on them. So it's like when you work for a company, right? So it's kind of like when you work for a company, every morning you wake up, you're like, oh, there's so many new emails, right? So for an open source developer, it's like every morning you wake up and you pray, okay, like how many issues we got today? And you're like, if you got an empty inbox, that's like, that literally haven't happened in a few years. But like, if that ever happens, I'm like, yeah, is my email not working today or
exactly.
something?
And for those who don't know, issues in the open source world basically means somebody came in and said, I've got a problem, I've got an issue of some sort, and it could be there's a real bug. It could be, I think there's a bug, but it turns out it's actually my fault, but I need somebody to walk me through that. Yeah. Sometimes it's also like, hey, here's a new feature I'd want. So there's all of these. It's basically the primary way that your consumers of your code basically are communicating with you, right?
Exactly. So, and for a very long time, I think when GitHub was initially created, this idea of putting your open source code out there and anyone can just come by and open an issue and like report something. Like you don't even need to be reporting something to open an issue. You can literally just say like your work is great or your work is piece of crap. Like there's no barrier whatsoever for people to open an issue, and that created problem when your project is so high visibility. Like there could be literally like 20, 30 issues created every single day, to the point where like some of us earlier had to create custom solutions where like we created bots to like filter the issues, and if it doesn't like follow a certain format, we'll just like comment and say, okay, like down, you need to fill this form. We'll close it now, but it could come back with the correct info or something. Like when your project is small, right? You typically like when you get an issue, you're like, okay, someone is actually using my software.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, okay, like what's your problem? Like let's figure it out. And so you like go back and forth until you figure something out. But
let's spend 3 hours pair programming on this.
Yeah, like when you realize you have to do this for 30 people every day.
Yes.
Okay, this is not sustainable.
That's not sustainable. Right?
So one big thing like I realized personally is like you need to set a boundary. Also, you need to realize like it's not a typical customer provider relationship, right? That's why I set up this whole sponsorship thing so that we don't have a direct like if you open an issue I must answer you like in
right because you paid me at this tier or whatever. Like
yeah, right. Because that would create a really weird incentive, and that would become really toxic for my life because I would just be caught up in tickets all day. Which is exactly the kind of support work that I want to avoid. Right?
Do you tend to feel, and I don't want to ask you to trash talk your consumers at all, but do you, consumers, users, do you experience like a sense of entitlement at times from people where they like that you're beholden to help them purely because they're on the internet open up an issue, or do you feel like that's something that doesn't happen that much?
It happens once in a while. Okay. It's not very often now. Like after we set up this requirement form,
which you were about to talk about. Sorry.
Yeah, so the requirement form, we try to first we come up with a paragraph like, okay, why do you need to use this? Right? Then we talk about, okay, maintaining popular open source software is a lot of work. We have limited bandwidth, and if we, allow anyone to open any issue every day, like there's just no way we'll ever do any work. Right. So in order to help us and help you, please, fill out this form, provide accurate information, and all that, blah, blah, blah. So typically when people read that, they kind of cool down and realize, okay, like I actually need to figure out some of this part of the problem myself.
Yes.
And it makes it more like they try to work with you to figure out what's wrong, rather than coming up with a support ticket like, hey, something's not working, help me figure it out.
Yes, right? That's a huge distinction.
Yeah, right. So that kind of filters out a lot of this sort of people who want to. So I can understand because, like, especially for beginners, when you use a new piece of software and it's not working, you'll be frustrated and you'll be like this is crap. I just want to go there and vent. Right?
Yeah.
It does happen, but like but issue if you don't set a barrier, you don't sort of filter it down, it's just not going to be sustainable for the maintainer. And GitHub realized that, so a lot of us have been asking for this feature for a very long time, and they just finally shipped it a while ago, like allowing you to create required form fields for creating new issues. And it's been like, 2 to 3 years after we've been using our custom solutions.
Yes, yeah. And I've done the issue templates, but I don't think that the templates alone are that. It sounds like this is something more than what I'm using that I haven't followed.
Yeah, it's new. Yeah.
Okay, cool. That's awesome.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that allows you to basically structure the feedback you're getting from people in a way that both helps it be a little bit more helpful, but also you can use it to encourage them to have done more of that work on their own effectively.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So the biggest difference is you can now require certain fields instead of just a template, because like sometimes people would just like willfully ignore it.
Delete everything out of the template and just type whatever they want anyway. Yep.
Yeah.
No, that's super helpful. So I kind of I want to keep talking about these things, but I want to leave a little bit of space for us to talk about kind of your life as just a remote worker. So I think I kind of want to move there a little bit since we're running a little bit short on time. So is there anything else you want to talk about with regard to issues or sponsorship, or you feel comfortable kind of moving on a little bit?
Then we can move on. Yeah.
All right. So you talked a little bit about how, as an open source maintainer, that you don't work for somebody else. You work for yourself, but in a way that I work for myself, and I also have a whole bunch of employees that does not give me the same level of freedom that you have, that you working for yourself looks like. So can you talk to me a little bit about like what is the life? Because you said, I want to enjoy what I'm doing. I want to have this kind of freedom to live this kind of life. What is the life that you have been afforded, that you're able to create for yourself as a result of having this sort of work that you weren't able to do when you're an employee? And can you tell me a little bit kind of like the experience of gaining that life, and what does that look like, making that happen for yourself?
Sure. So the first important thing is you're not physically tied to a specific area. I just moved from United States to Singapore last year, bringing the whole family over, right?
Yeah.
Without ever thinking about job or income. The decision is solely because we want to move into a more urban area with tighter cultural connection to the family, right? And I can prioritize the things that's more about life rather than work, because after I moved here, work did not change at all. So essentially I get like global pay. I can literally move anywhere in the world that I want. I can still work the same way that I work today and make the same amount of money.
You need an internet connection and a power cord, basically.
I do need internet connection.
But I mean, that's pretty broad options, though.
Yeah. Let's say if I'm single, I'll probably be a digital nomad, right?
Yeah, me too.
Yeah, but even with family, I still get really high mobility to be able to live in any city that I prefer, like that I think is better for my family or my kids. Right? This sort of freedom of being able to just being able to prioritize what you think is important for your family, for your life, rather than think about, okay, like I can only find this level of paying job in this specific area, so I have to stick here.
Yeah, I want to live near my family, but I can't. I want to live near this ocean, but I can't. I want to live whatever, but I can't because there's not good. And I've been there before. I've definitely, and I'm sure you have as well, where you say, oh, well, I need to stay here where I can get the type of paying job I want. And just imagining uprooting that dependency and just saying, I can live literally whatever I want and do my job. That's pretty incredible. Yeah. Do you also get schedule flexibility? Like, is your day more free to like, oh, the kids are coming home from school, I'll just dip out for 2 hours and go play with them or whatever?
That's exactly what I do.
Okay, cool. I love it. Yeah, that's awesome.
So I got a lot more freedom of being able to spend more time with kids. It's funny because after we moved here, my daughter is going to a half-day daycare. So me and my wife drive to pick her up every day.
That's
awesome. Typically there are other parents there picking their kids up, and usually there's only one parent there. So another mom saw us and like, oh, you both come pick her up every day. And we're like, yeah. And
like, that's pretty great.
So cute. Yeah, it's good.
That's awesome. I love that.
Yeah.
And I mean, it is like if you were to define the time that a parent works during the day, it wouldn't be 9 to 5, like to be present and kind of connected to their kids. It would be bits and blips here and there. Like my kids are old enough that they're in school. So I would be completely with them and then I would work the hours they're at school. And this is what I do because I have similar flexibility, but like I'm completely with them and then they get home from school and then I'm just with them and then I put them to bed and then I finish my work in that evening because that's what makes sense as a parent, right? But a lot of people don't have that same level of flexibility. So yeah, I totally hear that.
Yeah, and not just the day schedule, but also I tend to find myself, especially I guess for freelancers or remote workers, typically I don't find myself fit to this sort of be on a sprint forever kind of mode, right? When I'm working on something, if I'm this kind of, I have these up and down productive cycles over the year.
Amen.
In a few months, I'm working on this great thing. I want to push for it every single day until I'm done with it. And then I feel like, oh, I'm exhausted. I want to take a break.
Yeah.
I can literally just like take a whole week off.
Yeah.
Without letting anyone know. And then I come back. Right. Sometimes you would, I've experienced burnout. Or sometimes you just, there are other things happening in your life, which is, makes you feel like, okay, I'm not productive at all. Yeah. So, okay, let's just take some time off because there's no one saying, okay, you need to check in 9 to 5 every day. You need to have a weekly report every week. Yeah. It's a different mindset. It's more about prioritizing, like, you can basically cater to your own productivity cycle. If I feel productive, I can work more. If I feel I'm down or burned out, I can take some time off.
I love that.
And
and that's one of the cool things about that is that the whole idea of I don't have a boss is something that people love. But I think in the end, like not having a boss doesn't mean you don't have clients in a lot of contexts. So like I don't have a boss, but I have clients that end up paying the bills, and so I still have to consider them and their needs. Whereas I think in your setting, you have like the person who ultimately decides what success looks like for you is you. And like in theory, like you could slack off enough that your sponsors might start saying like, hey, whatever. So but that's such a distant thing. Nobody's going to do that on a week by week basis, right? You didn't, nobody reasonable. You didn't respond to my issue this week. Therefore I'm going to, within 7 days, therefore I'm going to cancel your sponsorship. So like in the end, it feels like you are the one who defines whether you have done the work that you believe you should do. And those of us who are sponsoring you are not defining what you should do and holding you to it, but supporting you by believing that what you're doing is the right thing to be doing. Like I trust Evan Yu to do the right thing, and I want to give him money to keep doing that. And if him knowing that means taking some time on and some time off, cool. Whatever makes Evan Yu happy, I'm happy for.
Yeah, that's exactly the keyword is trust, right? Similar to how open source itself is a trust relationship. Yeah. Because when you're not paying for something, right? There's always, usually there's a catch to it. And with open source, the catch is you need to trust whoever is writing that code, right?
That's good.
When you pick a piece of free software, you're basically saying, okay, I trust the person who's working on it to be a good steward in the long run.
Yeah, that's a good word.
That like, for example, for Vue, like Evan will stay responsible. Right. He will keep thinking about how to make Vue better, and not just go there and go to the beach every day or something like that.
And he wouldn't disappear off the face of the planet one day and leave it with no succession plan or whatever, right?
Yeah, because there's a track record of me doing this. I've been doing this full time since 2016, so it's like been 6 years.
Wow, I can't believe it's been that long.
Yeah,
that's amazing, man.
Vue is almost 8 years old. Can you believe that?
I feel old. I feel
like in 2 years, I'll be the author of a 10-year-old software. Like it's like it's already making me feel old.
I was literally telling someone the story of how we met, and I was like, I was Twitch live streaming when I was first learning Vue, and some guy whose name I didn't recognize showed up on my Twitch live stream and answered a question. I was like, thanks, because I didn't know what it was. And then I learned it was you, and I'm like, but this was the earliest days. This was like when it was like a little, and in my mind when I was telling the story, like literally yesterday, because someone's like, who's your podcast guest tomorrow? I was like, Evan. And I was telling the story as if it was 2 years ago in my brain. And I was like, and now you're telling me this, I'm like, that was not 2 years ago.
Yeah.
Oh my God. That's so cool that it's been that much of your recent life that you've been able to kind of like be making this space for yourself. As you think about what you like about what you're doing and the freedom that it affords you, I mean, we talked a little bit about where you're living and the hours you're working, but are there any other aspects of this whole, like, the way that being a full-time open source maintainer changes your life? Less like your interaction with the sponsors or the code, but like how it impacts you. Is there anything else there that you want to talk about?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's important because open source is also about connection to people, right? It's not me completely working alone because we do have a team. Yeah. Vue has a team, Vite has a team, but I mean, it's a very interesting thing how you organize open source communities, teams, because as I said, I don't want to be a boss. I don't want to, hire people and then tell them what to do. So that creates some challenge for scaling projects because, in certain ways, companies is a structure that's created so that multiple people can work on the same thing and be more efficient, collaborating. But open source is a different kind of relationship because a lot of our team members, they have their own full-time jobs. Some of them work as freelancers, and some of them are also trying to make sponsorship work, right? But I try not to act like a boss and tell them what to do. The kind of work I try to do is to sort of guide their interest. Like, what are you interested in contributing to the ecosystem? Right. And give feedback, like say, okay, this is an area that's worth exploring and you're doing great work. Maybe we can work on to push this a bit further, or I can tell them, like, I believe this is becoming a really important part of you. And if you want to, you can step up and take more responsibility. You encourage them to grow into certain roles, but you never force them to do certain things. It's always try to either mentor or try to just guide them into and help them discover what they want to do, instead of saying, okay, I'm your boss now. Like, you need to do this.
That's what you're gonna do. Yeah.
Just close all these issues by end of the day, something like that.
Yeah. That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up the word mentor, because I was thinking about the relationship between my employees, and also I talked to Taylor Otwell, who has actual employees doing a lot of this stuff, versus the people I mentor or the people who contribute to the open source repositories that I'm responsible for. And it is very different in that way. Like, with the people I mentor, I say, here are things that would probably help for you to be learning, and let's match up that with the things you're interested in. And maybe here's an open source repository that you could do this thing on if it's interesting to you. And I'll also guide it. Like, they might be like, oh, this is really cool. I'm like, yeah, but that's not going to help you, or that's not going to help them. So there's guidance, but the guidance is shaped down from what they're interested in the first place versus shaped down from what I want you to be working on. And whereas with my employees, again, they have space during their day. They've got 20% time every week to do what they want. But when I'm telling you what to do, and especially watching Taylor, his interactions with his employees, he's like, well, those issues need to be closed, and I'm paying you for you. So it's like a different set of, and it's not anything wrong with Taylor's way of doing it at all. But it's just a very different working relationship. So it's cool for you to kind of call out that difference. Yeah.
I mean, sometimes I do wish I have a real employee where I can tell them, hey, we need to get this done by today. Yeah. But on the other hand, when I think about the overhead of, it's also pressure for you to have people whose livelihood just depends on you. Right?
Oh yeah.
Being an employer is not easy in a lot of ways, and I totally get that, right? So I guess sometimes I just try to be honest with myself. If I start a company and hire a bunch of people, will I'll be enjoying the things I do? The answer is probably no, because I literally have no interest in thinking about payroll, thinking about tax benefits, and when you should get a raise, how we should build a company culture. I mean, those are important things if you're starting a company, but those are not the things that I want to spend most of my time doing every day. I still enjoy writing code. I still enjoy just like noodling every day about like, okay, how can we make this faster in Vue? How can we do this? How can we do that?
Yeah.
Right? That's what I want to do. That's what I enjoy. So, and the setup that I've created for myself allows me to do that with enough freedom, right?
I like that.
Sometimes there are like, there are still strings attached. Like I need to think about like, okay, like sometimes we need to talk to sponsors to convince them this is actually something worth doing. Sometimes you need to like optimize certain things so that, your ads get better returns or like your listings get more visibility. There will be this kind of small, tedious work, but like compared to the major chunk of body of work that I'm doing, those overhead I'm okay with. But if that grows into actually managing people, I realize that's going to be turning my life into something that I don't enjoy as much. Right?
Yeah. And I really enjoy the fact that like what you're saying here is I know the work I want to do. I know the work I don't want to do. I know where I thrive. I know what things are going to make me miserable. Because in the end, like one of the benefits that comes from owning a company is like I have ADHD. I would be a really bad employee in a lot of settings. And I unknowingly created a space where there's people around me who are basically protecting me from myself and making so like Dave is the most type A structured person of all time. And so he at Titan type A structures things because I don't have that in my brain. So Dave does that while I think of wild ideas and write stuff and create code, right? So I am creating, similar to you, creating the spaces for myself to thrive. And I had Adam Wathan on the podcast recently. We talked about some of these things as well. Each of us is going to find like a different road to that. But I do think like the agency that comes from being the one who makes the decisions in whatever shape or form means we can start by asking the question of like, where will I thrive? And how can I create the environment in which I will thrive? And you're not going to thrive running a company, right? You're like, I'm going to thrive writing code as much of the day as possible. Then great. That's awesome. So I love hearing that. So I know we're pretty far back on time. So before I ask you the last question, is there anything else you wanted to cover today that we didn't get to?
I think that's it. Yeah, it's a really good conversation. Yeah,
I loved it. And obviously, I say this all the time, but I could talk to you for another 3 hours. But I think we have a relatively well capped off thing. So we're going to get to the last question, which is, what insight or support did you either need or receive when you were younger that you hope people will give to others?
Yeah, I think we touched upon that just when you were summing up, you need to figure out what kind of person you are and what kind of work that you would thrive doing, right? I realize like everybody needs to find a purpose that kind of, that drives you doing the same thing over and over every day. And if it's a chore, it's going to wear you down, and your life's gonna be miserable because every day you are fighting your instinct of not wanting to do something. And I have really bad procrastination when I was in school because I'm the kind of person who like if I do something that I really enjoy doing, I can be really productive. But if I'm forced to do something that I don't want to do, I'll just like drag on it like forever. All right, so. And during school, I realized like this is just who I am, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Every one of us have similar problems. Like I've read all these books about like how to stop procrastination, how to be more efficient. They don't help.
No, not
this
at all.
is just who I am.
Exactly.
So right? The hack is, putting yourself in a situation where your natural tendency just, drives you forward.
Right.
So that's what I've intentionally created for myself.
I love that.
So that I can just do the things that I really want to do. And
that makes me so happy to hear, man. I love that. And I forget what it's called. I think there's like a procrastination monkey. Have you ever seen this? There's a talk, and then somebody made an animated version. I'll find it, link it, send it to you in text, and then also link it in the show notes. But it's basically this whole thing about how a lot of our brains deal with procrastination. But it and many other such things that I appreciate don't say, well, just stop it, right? Like, well, just do better. Just like, it's just like, this is who I am. And let's just build a system where I succeed, because a lot of like, especially in the US and the West, I don't know about, where you grew up, but like, there's a lot of this, like, you must fit this particular box. And if you're not fitting this box, you need to work harder to fit this box. And there's no permission given. Like, maybe there's a box that fits me better that I can build myself,
Totally.
So I love that.
think outside
really
of the
cool.
box and build your own
Yeah.
box.
Oh my God, I didn't even do that on purpose. I love it. Okay, Evan, this was an absolute delight. If people are really excited to hear about you and they want to know more about what you're doing or they want to support you, what does it look like for them to follow or support you?
You can follow me on Twitter. My Twitter handle is You Yuxi. That's my Chinese name. YOUYUXI. And if you're on GitHub, my GitHub ID is YYX990803. Okay, I probably need to think
can link in the show notes.
of better ideas. Yeah, link in the show notes.
I think that was what I think that's what your Twitch handle was when I didn't know who you were. I was like, thanks, YXZZZ, whatever.
Yeah.
I love that.
But the important thing is, on GitHub, you can sponsor me directly. If you use my work, that would be a great place to start. Yeah.
Okay. Totally random connection. I don't know anything about Mandarin, but I saw that your English handle is Yo Yushi, and then your Chinese handle is Yushi Yo. Is that like a surname, first name kind of situation, or is that a common switch, or is that just you playing around with your name?
It's just playing around because I registered the Yo Yushi, which is surname first, but that account is using English.
Yeah.
And then later on, I registered another alt, which is using Chinese, but the main one is already taken. I don't want to switch it over to confuse people, so I just use the Western placement for the Chinese
for that one, because it's like, hey, we're flipping it anyway, right? Yeah. Okay. I figured it was like the surname situation, but I didn't realize it was flipped. So thank you. And I was actually going to ask you to pronounce it because I want to say it right in my head every time I read it, and I know whatever I was doing before you just said it out loud for me wasn't right. So thank you for that. So all right. Well, I guess that was it. So, Evan, thank you so much for taking some time, especially in the middle of the morning. I know there's probably kids running around and everything like that. So I really appreciate you. And this was freaking fantastic, man. I really enjoyed it.
Yep. I really enjoyed it too. Great talk.
Awesome. And to the rest of y'all, until I see you next time, be good to each other.
Bye.